Good evening, my sleepy scholars. Tonight we're going to talk about a place that never existed, and yet refuses to stay gone. Atlantis sits in that strange territory between historical record and collective dream. Not quite real, not quite forgotten, stubbornly persistent in ways that tell us more about ourselves than about any actual sunken island. What follows is a slow walk through what was actually written, what we've decided it means, and why a fictional city invented as a thought experiment keeps surfacing in conversations about human history. Super stoked you guys chose the Made for Sleep channel for this specific story. Get super comfy, let us know how you are doing, and let's zoom on through the sleep cycle. The thing about Atlantis is that we know exactly where it came from. There's no mystery about the source material. Around 360 BCE, an Athenian philosopher named Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in which he described a powerful island nation that waged war against Athens 9,000 years before his time, then sank into the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction. He presented this story through the voice of Critias, who claimed to have heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests during his travels to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. The narrative structure matters here. Plato wasn't writing history. He was writing philosophy disguised as history, using an invented past to explore ideas about ideal governments, military hubris, and divine punishment. The Atlantis story appears in his work as a rhetorical device, a cautionary tale designed to illustrate what happens when a society becomes corrupt and overreaches. The whole thing is a setup for a discussion about justice and the proper ordering of states. We know this because Plato tells us. The structure of the dialogues makes it clear that he's constructing an allegory. The problem is that he made his allegory too specific, too detailed, too convincing. He gave Atlantis dimensions and geography and architectural descriptions. He described its government structure, its military organization, its agricultural output, its mineral resources. He built a complete world, and then he sank it. And somewhere in the centuries that followed, people started wondering if maybe he'd been describing something real. That wondering never stopped. Lying in bed tonight, trying to trace how a philosophical thought experiment became one of the most persistent legends in human history, means starting with what Plato actually wrote. Not the simplified version that appears in popular culture. Not the distorted interpretations that show up in pseudo-archaeology books. The actual text in as much detail as he provided, which turns out to be quite a lot. According to Plato's account in the Critias, Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. The island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which in ancient Greek geography meant it was enormous, perhaps the size of a small continent. The land was fertile and rich in resources. Mountains rose along the northern coast, protecting the interior from cold winds. The southern plain was described as the most beautiful and fertile in the world, rectangular in shape, measuring 3,000 stadia in one direction and 2,000 in the other. For context, a stadion was roughly 600 feet, making this plain approximately 340 miles by 230 miles, roughly the size of the entire island of Ireland. The island was ruled by 10 kings, all descendants of Poseidon, the sea god, who had divided the realm among his 5 sets of twin sons. The firstborn, Atlas, received the central region and the title of High King, which is where we get the name Atlantis, the island of Atlas. The other 9 kings ruled their territories, but deferred to Atlas in matters affecting the whole island. They met regularly in the great temple of Poseidon to discuss laws and pass judgment on those who violated them. Plato describes an elaborate ritual where they hunted a bull within the sacred precinct using only wooden clubs, then sacrificed it and mixed its blood with wine while swearing oaths of loyalty to their common laws. The level of architectural detail Plato provides is remarkable and specific in ways that lend the account an air of authenticity. He describes the central citadel of Atlantis as protected by alternating rings of water and land, 3 concentric rings of water, 2 rings of land, with the innermost island containing the royal palace and the great temple of Poseidon. Each ring of land was separated from the next by channels of water, and bridges connected them, with tunnels cut through the earth at water level to allow ships to pass from one ring to the next, entering the central harbour. The outermost ring of land was fortified with walls covered in brass, he says. The middle ring's walls were covered with tin. The innermost island's walls were covered with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as shining like fire and being second in value only to gold. This orichalcum is mentioned repeatedly in his account, mined from beneath the earth in many parts of the island. No one today is entirely sure what orichalcum was. Some scholars think it might have been a brass or bronze alloy. Others suggest it was pure copper with a particular finish. Still others think Plato invented it entirely. The Temple of Poseidon itself was, according to Plato, a stadium in length, roughly 600 feet, proportionately wide and of a suitable height. The exterior was covered entirely in silver except for the roof peaks, which were gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory inlaid with gold, silver and orichalcum. The walls and pillars and floors were similarly decorated. In the centre stood a statue of Poseidon, so tall his head touched the ceiling, showing the god standing in a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 nereids riding dolphins. Hot and cold springs bubbled up on the island, providing water that was channeled to fountains and baths, to groves of trees, and to reservoirs. Plato describes elaborate bathhouses, some open to the sky, others enclosed, some for royalty, others for private citizens, others for women, still others for horses and pack animals. The water from the spring supposedly had the health-giving properties, and the Atlanteans built their civilization around these resources. The military capabilities of Atlantis were equally detailed in Plato's telling. The island could field 1,200 ships and 10,000 chariots. The plain was divided into 60,000 administrative districts, each required to provide specific numbers of soldiers: foot soldiers, charioteers, light infantry, slingers, archers. The system was precisely organised, with clear quotas for each region based on its size and population. This gave Atlantis a standing army of extraordinary size and sophistication, organised with a level of bureaucratic precision that sounds almost modern. The Atlanteans were formidable warriors who had already conquered parts of Europe and Africa, Plato tells us, controlling territory as far as Egypt in one direction and Tuscany in the other. They were poised to conquer Athens and the rest of Greece when the Athenians, alone among Greek cities, stood against them and defeated them in a great battle. This victory demonstrated Athens' superior virtue and military excellence, which was Plato's whole point in constructing the story. Athens, properly organised according to the principles he advocated, could defeat even the most powerful empire. But then came the catastrophe. Zeus, king of the gods, saw that the Atlanteans had become corrupt, forgetting their divine origins and becoming obsessed with wealth and power. He called the other gods together to pronounce judgment, and here Plato's text breaks off mid-sentence. We never get the speech. We never get the explicit divine verdict. But we know the outcome from the Timaeus, where the story is introduced. Earthquakes and floods destroyed the island in a single day and night, and Atlantis sank into the sea, leaving behind a barrier of impassable mud that made the Atlantic Ocean unnavigable in that region. That's the story. That's what Plato actually wrote. It's specific enough to seem credible, vague enough about certain details to allow for interpretation, dramatic enough to stick in cultural memory, and morally clear enough to serve its purpose as an allegory about pride coming before a fall. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The archaeological and geological evidence is overwhelming that it didn't, at least not in the form Plato described. The question is why Plato's invention became something people have been searching for ever since, and what that search tells us about how humans process history and myth. Part of the answer lies in timing and context. Plato wrote during a period when Athens was grappling with its own imperial overreach and eventual decline. The Peloponnesian War had ended badly for Athens in 404 BCE, just a few decades before Plato wrote these dialogues. Athenian democracy had proved vulnerable to demagoguery and poor decision-making. The city had committed atrocities, most notoriously the massacre of the entire adult male population of Melos and the enslavement of its women and children, simply because the Melians wished to remain neutral. The disastrous Sicilian expedition had cost Athens most of its navy and thousands of lives, and most personally for Plato, Athens had executed Socrates in 399 BCE. condemning his teacher to death on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Plato was working through profound questions about power, corruption, justice, and the fragility of civilizations. He'd seen his city at the height of its power and prestige, then watched it decline through a combination of hubris, poor leadership, and moral decay. He'd witnessed democracy produce terrible outcomes. He'd lost faith in the ability of ordinary citizens to make sound judgments about complex political questions. Atlantis served as a mirror for all of this. It was Athens taken to an extreme, powerful, organized, technologically advanced, militarily dominant, but ultimately undone by hubris and moral decay. The story functioned as a warning. This is what happens when a society abandons virtue in favor of expansion and wealth. This is what happens when people forget their higher nature and become obsessed with material gain. The gods notice. The gods respond. The civilization ends, not gradually but catastrophically, in a single day and night of complete destruction. But Plato's contemporaries understood the literary device. They read the dialogues as philosophy, not history. They recognized the Atlantis story as a constructed example, similar to the allegory of the cave in the Republic, or the myth of that concludes that work. These were teaching tools, narrative frameworks for exploring abstract ideas. Nobody in Plato's immediate circle seems to have thought he was describing an actual historical event. The confusion started later, as the texts circulated beyond Athens and beyond Plato's immediate philosophical community. Context got lost. The dialogues were copied and recopied, translated and retranslated. Readers encountered the Atlantis description without fully grasping its function in Plato's larger philosophical project. And because the details were so specific and vivid, because Plato had constructed his fictional world so carefully, it started to seem like maybe, just maybe, he'd been describing something real. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, apparently dismissed Atlantis as his teacher's invention. According to the geographer Strabo, writing centuries later, Aristotle said that Plato could make Atlantis appear and make it disappear, suggesting he understood it as a literary construct under the author's control, not a historical claim. But this dismissal didn't settle the question for everyone. Other ancient writers took different positions. Crantor, a philosopher who lived about a generation after Plato, reportedly claimed that Egyptian priests had confirmed the Atlantis story, showing Crantor columns inscribed with the account that Solon had supposedly heard. But we only know about this claim through much later sources, and no archaeological evidence of such columns has ever been found. It's entirely possible that Crantor was elaborating on Plato's fiction, adding another layer to the narrative. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, mentioned Atlantis in his Natural History, but treated it skeptically, grouping it with other legendary islands. Plutarch, writing around the same time, discussed Atlantis in his work on the Face in the Moon, placing it in the context of myths and philosophical speculation rather than history. By the time we reach the medieval period, Atlantis has already begun its transformation from allegory to possibility. Arabic scholars preserved and commented on Plato's works during the period when much of classical learning was lost in Western Europe. When Europeans rediscovered Plato through these intermediary sources during the Renaissance, the Atlantis story came with accumulated layers of commentary and speculation. Some of this commentary treated the account as potentially historical. Maybe Plato had access to genuine Egyptian records that have since been lost. Maybe the priests really did tell Solon about a lost civilization. Maybe the 9,000 years was a translation error or a scribal mistake. But the basic outline was accurate. The age of exploration accelerated this process dramatically. When European ships started crossing the Atlantic and discovering the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, some scholars immediately connected this to Plato's account. Here was a vast landmass beyond the Pillars of Hercules, previously unknown to Europeans, apparently confirming that Plato's geography was at least partially accurate. The fact that indigenous civilizations in the Americas had built impressive cities and monuments without, as far as Europeans knew, any contact with Old World civilizations seemed to suggest the possibility of independent development or perhaps ancient connections that had been forgotten. Francis Bacon wrote The New Atlantis in 1626, explicitly linking the Americas to Plato's story and using the conceit of a lost advanced civilization to explore ideas about science, society, and human progress. The idea gained traction that perhaps Atlantis wasn't a sunken island, but a memory of the American continents, preserved in distorted form through Egyptian and Greek traditions. This interpretation had obvious problems. The Americas hadn't sunk into the ocean, for one thing, and the indigenous peoples had their own long histories that didn't match Plato's timeline. But it established a pattern that continues today. Take Plato's descriptions, find something in the real world that matches part of it. Adjust the details as needed to make the fit work. Declare you found Atlantis, or at least identified what inspired it. The Mediterranean itself offers several candidates that match elements of the story, and these are worth examining in detail because they reveal what might have actually inspired Plato, assuming he drew on any real events at all rather than pure invention. The most compelling candidate, and the one most archaeologists point to when asked about possible historical inspirations for Atlantis, is the volcanic island of Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera. Around 1628 BCE, give or take a few years, the exact dating is still debated, the volcano at the centre of the island exploded in one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. The explosion was cataclysmic. It ejected an estimated 60 cubic kilometres of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The eruption column probably reached 36 kilometres into the stratosphere. The ash cloud would have darkened the sky across the entire eastern Mediterranean for days or weeks. Tsunamis generated by the eruption and the subsequent caldera collapse would have devastated coastal settlements for hundreds of miles in all directions. The explosion was so violent that it collapsed the centre of the island, creating the caldera that exists today, a roughly circular bay surrounded by steep cliffs, open to the sea on one side. What had been a round island with a mountain in the middle became a crescent of land enclosing a deep water-filled crater. The transformation would have been total and shocking to anyone who survived and returned to see what remained. On the southern coast of Santorini, buried under meters of volcanic ash and pumice, lies Akrotiri, a Bronze Age city frozen in time like a Mediterranean Pompeii. The settlement was abandoned before the eruption. No human remains have been found in the extensive excavations, suggesting the inhabitants had warning and evacuated. But they left behind a remarkably preserved snapshot of Minoan civilization at its height. The excavation of Akrotiri, which began in 1967 under the direction of Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, revealed a level of cultural advancement that rivals anything in the contemporary Mediterranean. The buildings were multi-storey, some reaching 3 or 4 floors. They had sophisticated drainage systems with ceramic pipes running under the floors and through the walls. The rooms were decorated with elaborate frescoes showing religious ceremonies, maritime scenes, boxing matches, and springtime landscapes with flowers and swallows. The quality of the artwork is extraordinary. Vivid colours, fluid compositions, attention to detail that demonstrates both skill and leisure time to develop such skill. The settlement had paved streets. It had large public buildings that might have been administrative centres or shrines. It had evidence of extensive trade connections, pottery from Crete, obsidian from Melos, copper probably from Cyprus. The inhabitants were literate, using the Linear A script that we still can't fully decipher. They had standardized weights and measures. They had specialized craftspeople producing pottery, textiles, metalwork, jewelry. This was not a primitive village. This was an urban centre participating in the sophisticated Bronze Age world of the Aegean, connected through trade and culture to the palace civilizations of Crete and the mainland. And it was destroyed in a single catastrophic event, buried so thoroughly that it remained hidden for 36 centuries. The connection to Atlantis is obvious enough that many people, on first learning about Santorini and Akrotiri, immediately assume this must be what Plato was describing, an advanced island civilization, destroyed in a catastrophic disaster, gone in what must have seemed like a single day to anyone experiencing it, or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. The parallels are striking enough that numerous books and documentaries have presented Santorini as the real Atlantis. the historical event that inspired Plato's allegory. But there are significant problems with this identification, problems substantial enough that most professional archaeologists and ancient historians don't accept it. First, the timeline doesn't match. Santorini exploded around 1600 BCE. Plato, writing around 360 BCE, claimed Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it around 9600 BCE. That's a discrepancy of roughly 8,000 years. You can argue that Plato or his sources got the numbers wrong, that 9,000 should be 900, that there was a translation error when Solon heard the story in Egypt. But that requires assuming Plato made a factual error in a text where he's otherwise quite careful with details, and it requires a very specific error that just happens to make the timeline work. Second, the geography doesn't match. Santorini is in the Aegean Sea, firmly within the Mediterranean, nowhere near the Pillars of Hercules that Plato explicitly places as Atlantis' location. You can argue that Plato deliberately changed the location to make his story work allegorically, to place Atlantis beyond the known world and make it more exotic. But again, that requires assuming he was drawing on real events, and then deliberately obscuring them in ways that make verification impossible. Third, the scale doesn't match. Akrotiri was a substantial town, but it wasn't a vast empire controlling territory from Egypt to Tuscany. Santorini is a small island, nowhere near the size of Libya and Asia combined. The Minoan civilization of which Akrotiri was part did have significant influence in the Aegean, but it wasn't threatening to conquer the Greek mainland. The power dynamics Plato describes don't fit the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Plato would have known about Santorini. The Greeks colonized the island in the 8th century BCE, long before Plato's time. They called it Thera. They knew it had a volcanic caldera. They knew about the dramatic geography. If Plato had wanted to write about Santorini, he could have just written about Santorini. He didn't need to disguise it as an Atlantic island from 9,000 years in the past. So while Santorini demonstrates that catastrophic volcanic destruction of island civilizations was not just possible, but had actually happened in the Mediterranean, it doesn't neatly match Plato's account. The parallels are there: island, advanced culture, sudden destruction, volcanic involvement, but so are the discrepancies. The Minoan civilization on Crete provides another possible reference point. The Minoans were the dominant power in the Aegean during the Bronze Age, roughly from 2700 to 1450 BCE. Their palace culture, centered on sites like Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, showed remarkable sophistication. The palaces were elaborate multi-story complexes with hundreds of rooms, sophisticated drainage and ventilation systems, storage facilities holding enormous quantities of agricultural goods, workshops for specialized crafts, and administrative areas where scribes kept detailed records in Linear A and later Linear B. The palace at Knossos, the largest and most famous, covers roughly 20,000 square meters. It had indoor plumbing with terracotta pipes that brought fresh water in and carried wastewater out. It had a throne room with stone benches and elaborate frescoes. It had light wells bringing natural light into interior rooms. It had magazines, storage rooms, containing hundreds of pithoi, large ceramic jars that could each hold hundreds of litres of wine, oil, grain or other goods. The Minoans were skilled sailors and traders. Their pottery and other goods have been found throughout the Mediterranean and into the Near East. They imported copper from Cyprus, tin probably from Afghanistan or Anatolia, ivory from Syria, gold from Egypt. They exported wine, olive oil, textiles, and fine pottery. They maintained trade relationships with Egypt's New Kingdom, with the Hittite Empire, with the city-states of the Levant. Their art is distinctive and sophisticated. The frescoes at Knossos and other sites show religious processions, bull-leaping ceremonies, marine life, gardens, daily life. The style is fluid and naturalistic compared to the more formal Egyptian or Mesopotamian art of the same period. The colours are vivid, blues and reds and yellows and greens, made from mineral and organic pigments carefully prepared and applied to wet plaster. The Minoan civilization declined relatively rapidly, starting around 1500 BCE. The causes are still debated. The Santorini eruption around 1628 BCE certainly disrupted the region, though Crete is far enough from Santorini, about 60 miles, that direct destruction was probably limited to coastal areas hit by tsunamis. The main palaces show evidence of destruction and rebuilding multiple times during the Late Bronze Age. Some destructions appear to be from earthquakes, which are common in this seismically active region. Others might be from fires, raids, or internal conflicts. By 1450 BCE, Linear B, an early form of Greek, had replaced Linear A in the administrative records at Knossos, suggesting the palace had come under control of Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. By 1300 BCE, most of the major Minoan sites were abandoned. The trade networks had collapsed. The writing systems were no longer in use. The palace culture that had dominated the Aegean for over a millennium was effectively finished. Later, Greeks retained some memory of this earlier civilization, distorted and mythologized. The legend of the Minotaur and the labyrinth preserves a folk memory of Knossos and its complex palace architecture. The idea of Crete as a former great power, of King Minos as a powerful ruler, of tribute paid to Crete by mainland cities. These appear in various myths and suggest some cultural memory of Minoan dominance, however distorted. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, would have had access to these traditions even if he didn't understand their historical basis. Could Atlantis be a philosophical elaboration of Minoan Crete, combined with memories of the Santorini disaster, filtered through centuries of oral tradition and Egyptian records? It's possible. The geography doesn't match. Crete is in the Mediterranean, not the Atlantic, but as noted, Plato might have deliberately changed the location for his allegorical purposes. The problem is the same as with Santorini. If Plato wanted to write about Minoan Crete, why not just write about Crete? The Greeks knew about Crete. They had extensive mythological traditions about it. Plato could have used those traditions directly for his philosophical purposes. The fact that he instead invented an Atlantic island suggests he wasn't trying to preserve or recount actual history, distorted or otherwise. There's another candidate worth considering, this one matching Plato's timeline more closely than Santorini or Minoan Crete. The Greek city of Helike on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth was a significant regional power in classical Greece. It led the Achaean League, a confederation of cities in the northern Peloponnese. It minted its own coins. It sent colonists to southern Italy. It had a famous sanctuary of Poseidon that drew pilgrims from across Greece. In 373 BCE, just 13 years before Plato wrote the Timaeus and Critias, Helike was destroyed by an earthquake and subsequent tsunami. Ancient sources describe the destruction in vivid terms. The earthquake hit at night during winter. It was followed by a massive wave that swept over the city. Every building was destroyed. Every resident either drowned or was buried in the rubble. The site was submerged, visible beneath the water as ruins for years afterward. Ships sailing over the location could see the remains of temples and buildings below. Eventually, silt covered everything, and the city disappeared completely. Plato would have known about this. It was recent, dramatic, and widely discussed. The destruction of an entire city in a single night, swallowed by earthquake and flood, demonstrated that such catastrophes were not just mythical possibilities, but real events that could happen in the Greek world. Some scholars suggest Helike might have provided the template for Atlantis' destruction, even if the rest of the story drew on other sources or pure invention. The archaeological site of Helike was discovered in 2001 by a team led by Dora Katsonopoulou. The excavations, conducted in difficult conditions in a coastal lagoon, revealed a classical Greek city suddenly abandoned. Buildings collapsed, personal possessions left behind, evidence of earthquake damage and flooding throughout the site. The archaeological record confirms the ancient accounts of sudden catastrophic destruction. But a leak was not an advanced Bronze Age civilization from 9,000 years in the past. It was a contemporary Greek city that Plato and his readers would have known existed before its destruction. It's not hidden beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It's not an island. It didn't control an empire stretching from Egypt to Tuscany. It works as a potential inspiration for the mechanism of Atlantis' destruction. Earthquake and flood, sudden and complete, but not for the civilization itself. So we have real precedents for every element of the Atlantis story. Advanced Bronze Age civilizations that disappeared, the Minoans. Volcanic eruptions that devastated island communities, Santorini. Earthquakes that sank cities into the sea, Helike. All of these existed in the Mediterranean world that Plato knew, either through direct knowledge or through historical and mythological traditions. The most likely explanation is that Plato synthesized these various elements: folk memories of earlier civilizations, recent disasters, geographical knowledge of Atlantic exploration, existing myths about divine punishment, and pure creative invention, into a coherent narrative designed to serve his philosophical purposes. He wasn't trying to preserve history. He wasn't encoding secret knowledge. He was creating a compelling fictional example to illustrate abstract ideas about political philosophy, social organization, and moral decline. But the story proved too compelling. It took on a life independent of its author's intent. Lying here, thinking about why this particular myth has such extraordinary staying power across 24 centuries, means confronting something fundamental about how human minds work and what we need from our encounters with the past. We want Atlantis to be real, not because the evidence points that way, it emphatically doesn't, but because the idea satisfies psychological and cultural needs that have nothing to do with evidence. Atlantis represents lost potential, knowledge that was achieved and then forgotten, wisdom that we're struggling to recover. The story contains the appealing possibility that human societies have risen higher than we generally assume, that we might be rediscovering rather than discovering, that the past holds secrets we've lost and might find again. This is profoundly appealing for several interconnected reasons. First, it suggests history is less linear than we've been taught. The standard narrative of human progress goes something like this: primitive hunter-gatherers, development of agriculture, first cities, ancient civilizations, classical world, medieval period, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modern era. Each stage builds on the previous one, advancing technology and knowledge incrementally. It's not a smooth upward line, there are setbacks and dark ages, but the general trend is toward increasing complexity and capability. The Atlantis narrative disrupts this comfortable progression. It suggests that a civilization could have achieved advanced knowledge thousands of years before we think such achievements were possible, then disappeared so thoroughly that we lost everything they knew. History becomes cyclical rather than progressive. Rise and fall, advance and decline, discovery and forgetting. This pattern appears in many mythological and religious traditions. Golden ages followed by degeneration, paradise lost, falls from grace. There's something emotionally satisfying about cyclical history compared to linear progress. It's more dramatic. It allows for greater ups and downs. It suggests that if civilizations have fallen before, our own civilization's problems are part of a larger pattern, rather than unique failures. And it holds out the possibility of recovery, of rediscovering what was lost and perhaps avoiding the mistakes that led to earlier collapses. Second, the Atlantis story hints that conventional archaeology and mainstream science might be missing something important, that orthodox knowledge is incomplete or actively suppressing alternative interpretations. This is immensely appealing to people who distrust institutional authority or feel excluded from expert consensus. If the experts are wrong about Atlantis, what else might they be wrong about? If there's a lost civilization that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge, what other truths might be hidden? This anti-establishment appeal has made Atlantis a fixture in alternative archaeology, pseudoscience, and conspiracy theories. The people claiming to have found Atlantis are often positioning themselves as brave outsiders, fighting against a rigid academic establishment that refuses to consider evidence that contradicts established narratives. The fact that experts dismiss their claims becomes proof that the claims must be true. Why else would the establishment work so hard to suppress them? This dynamic is frustrating for actual archaeologists and historians who've spent careers carefully building knowledge through systematic research. The expert consensus about Atlantis isn't based on refusing to consider evidence. It's based on thoroughly evaluating the evidence and finding it doesn't support the claims being made. But that nuanced position is harder to communicate than the experts are hiding the truth, especially when people are predisposed to believe the latter. Third, Atlantis offers the romantic possibility of hidden knowledge waiting to be recovered, of wisdom that could transform our understanding if we could just find it. This taps into deep-seated human desires for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. Maybe the ancients knew things we've forgotten. Maybe there are alternative ways of understanding the world that modern science has overlooked. Maybe there's secret knowledge that would solve our contemporary problems if we could rediscover it. This yearning for lost wisdom appears across cultures and throughout history. Religious traditions often reference earlier revelations or golden ages of spiritual insight. Philosophical traditions invoke ancient sages who understood truths we've lost. Esoteric traditions claim to preserve secret knowledge passed down from earlier civilizations. The specifics vary, but the pattern is consistent. Things were better before, knowledge was greater, wisdom was deeper, and we're trying to recover what was lost. Atlantis slots perfectly into this pattern. It represents ultimate lost wisdom. An entire civilization's worth of knowledge disappeared beneath the waves, waiting for someone smart or brave or pure enough to rediscover it. The fact that no one has actually found this knowledge doesn't diminish its appeal. The search itself becomes meaningful. The possibility itself is generative. The idea itself does cultural work regardless of whether the referent actually exists. Fourth, Atlantis provides a narrative structure that feels emotionally and aesthetically satisfying. Rise, decline, fall, disappearance. It's a complete story arc. It has dramatic tension. It has moral weight. Pride comes before destruction. It has mystery. What exactly did they know? And could we find it? It has romance. A lost world beneath the waves. These are powerful story elements that resonate with how humans construct meaning through narrative. We are storytelling creatures. We understand our lives and our world through narratives. We remember stories better than we remember isolated facts. We believe narratives more readily than we believe abstract data. We find meaning in tales of lost civilizations more easily than in the careful incremental work of actual archaeology. This isn't necessarily a character flaw. Narrative thinking is powerful and useful. Stories help us organize complex information, identify patterns, make predictions, understand motivations, communicate shared values. The problem arises when we privilege narrative satisfaction over empirical evidence, when we let the appeal of a good story override our commitment to determining what's actually true. Atlantis is a great story, compelling, dramatic, thought-provoking. It's been productively inspiring fiction, art, philosophy, and speculation for 24 centuries. But being a great story doesn't make it history. The two categories need to remain distinct, even though they're not always easy to separate. The archaeological evidence regarding Atlantis is clear and consistent. There is no physical evidence for a continent-sized advanced civilization in the Atlantic Ocean 9,000 years before Plato's time. We have extensive knowledge of ocean floor geology, and there's no submerged continent where Plato places Atlantis. We have detailed understanding of sea level changes over the past 20,000 years, and there's no mechanism by which a landmass of the size Plato describes could have sunk completely in historical times. We also have remarkably detailed understanding of human cultural development over the past 12,000 years across the entire globe. We can trace the development of agriculture independently in multiple locations: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, West Africa, New Guinea. We can track the rise of the first cities in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Egypt, Mesoamerica. We can follow the invention of writing systems in Sumer, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. We can document the emergence of complex states, the development of metallurgy, the spread of technologies through trade and migration. This timeline is well established and supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. Radiocarbon dating provides absolute chronology. Pottery sequences and architectural styles provide relative chronology. Genetic data from ancient DNA shows population movements and admixtures. Paleobotanical evidence reveals what crops were grown where and when. Climate reconstructions from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment cores explain environmental contexts. Written records, where they exist, provide names and events and organizational details. All of this evidence fits together into a coherent picture of human development. There are gaps and uncertainties, plenty of them. There are ongoing debates about specific dates and sequences and interpretations. But the basic framework is solid and constantly being refined through new discoveries and new analytical techniques. There's no gap in this framework where an advanced Atlantic civilization could have existed and then completely disappeared without leaving traces. Advanced civilizations leave enormous amounts of physical evidence. They require infrastructure, buildings, roads, water systems, waste disposal. They generate material culture, tools, pottery, weapons, ornaments, ritual objects. They modify landscapes, clearing forests, digging irrigation channels, terracing hillsides, quarrying stone. They accumulate trash, broken pottery, animal bones, seeds, charcoal, human waste. They bury their dead, often with grave goods that survive for millennia. All of this leaves traces that archaeologists can detect and analyse. Stone tools persist for millions of years. Pottery sherds are effectively indestructible, lasting hundreds of thousands of years if left undisturbed. Foundation stones of buildings remain visible even after millennia of abandonment. Trash pits preserve organic materials through anaerobic conditions. Burial grounds contain skeletons, DNA, and objects placed with the dead. Even things that decay completely, wooden structures, textiles, leather, leave chemical signatures in the soil that can be detected with proper analysis. Human activity leaves evidence. That's not speculation or assumption. It's an empirical observation based on tens of thousands of excavated sites across every inhabited continent. The evidence accumulates in predictable ways that archaeologists have learned to read like a text. You cannot have a civilization advanced enough to build the kind of infrastructure Plato describes. The concentric rings, the elaborate temple, the sophisticated irrigation, the shipyards and harbours, without generating enormous quantities of archaeological evidence. And we have found such evidence all over the world for every civilization that actually existed. We found the Sumerians in southern Iraq, the Akkadians and Babylonians and Assyrians and dozens of other Mesopotamian cultures. We found the Harappans in the Indus Valley with their planned cities and undeciphered script. We found the Shang and Zhou dynasties in China with their oracle bones and bronze vessels. We found the Olmec and Maya and Aztec in Mesoamerica with their pyramids and hieroglyphic texts. We found complex societies in Peru, in West Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Polynesia, in North America, in every region where humans developed advanced social organisation. Their ruins are there. Their artefacts fill museums. Their writing systems are preserved, even when we can't yet fully read them. Their DNA is in the bones of their descendants. Their impacts on landscapes are visible in satellite imagery. Their stories persist in modified form in later cultures that succeeded them. But we haven't found Atlantis, because Atlantis is a philosophical thought experiment that Plato invented to make arguments about political organisation and moral decline. It was never meant to be history. It only became history when later readers, lacking the context of Plato's larger philosophical project, encountered the vivid details and started wondering if maybe it was based on something real. That wondering is understandable. Plato was a skilled writer. He made his fictional world detailed and convincing. He placed it in the past beyond verification. He attributed the story to respected sources, Egyptian priests, Solon, his own family's oral traditions. These are techniques fiction writers still use today to lend verisimilitude to invented worlds. And they work. They make the story feel real, even when it's not. But 2,400 years of wondering has not produced any physical evidence that supports the literal existence of Atlantis as Plato described it. No ruins beyond the Pillars of Hercules. No ancient maps showing a continent-sized island in the Atlantic. No Egyptian records confirming the story Solon supposedly heard. No artifacts bearing the characteristics Plato describes. No genetic evidence of a population that matches. No environmental evidence of a catastrophic sinking. Nothing. The absence of evidence is not by itself proof of absence. There are many historical events and peoples for which we currently lack archaeological evidence, but which might be discovered with future excavations. But after more than a century of systematic underwater archaeology, oceanographic surveys and Atlantic floor mapping, the absence of evidence for Atlantis has become pretty strong evidence of absence. If it was there, we would have found something by now. That hasn't stopped people from looking, and it hasn't stopped new theories from appearing with remarkable regularity. Atlantis has been located in dozens of places around the world, each location requiring its own set of adjustments to Plato's description to make the identification work. Beyond the Mediterranean candidates already discussed, Santorini, Crete, various other Greek islands, Atlantis has been placed in Sardinia, where Nuragic stone towers somewhat resemble Plato's description of Atlantean architecture if you squint. It's been placed in Malta, where impressive megalithic temples predate the pyramids of Egypt. It's been placed in the Canary Islands, which are in the Atlantic beyond Gibraltar, and have some indigenous stone structures. It's been placed in the Azores, volcanic islands in the mid-Atlantic, that some claim are mountain peaks of a submerged continent. It's been located in Antarctica, based on a theory that the continent was ice-free and inhabited before a crustal displacement shifted it to its current polar position. This requires rejecting essentially all of geology and geophysics, but that hasn't stopped books promoting the idea from selling well. It's been placed in the Caribbean, particularly around the Bahamas and Cuba, where sonar imagery has detected what some interpreters claim are artificial structures underwater. Geologists examining the same imagery see natural geological formations, but the Atlantis interpretation persists. It's been placed in the North Sea, in what's now called Doggerland, the landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe during the last ice age, and was gradually submerged as sea levels rose. This is at least geologically accurate as a real landmass that's now underwater, but it doesn't match Plato's description in location, timeline, or cultural characteristics. It's been placed in West Africa, in the Sahara Desert, where the Risha structure in Mauritania, a circular geological formation known as the Eye of the Sahara, somewhat resembles Plato's concentric rings if you ignore the fact that it's in the desert, not surrounded by water, and is a completely natural geological formation. It's been placed in Ireland, in the Black Sea, in Indonesia, in Sri Lanka, in Bolivia, in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Cyprus, in Troy. Each location has proponents who've written books and made documentaries explaining how their candidate is the true Atlantis, and how mainstream archaeology is ignoring the obvious evidence. What all these locations have in common is that they require significant modifications to Plato's account to make them work. The size is reinterpreted. Maybe Plato's measurements were symbolic rather than literal, or used different units than we think, or were exaggerated for effect. The timeline is revised. Maybe 9,000 years was a translation error, or meant something different, or was intentionally inflated. The geography is explained away. Maybe beyond the Pillars of Hercules meant something other than what it seems to mean. or the pillars themselves were located differently, or Plato deliberately changed the location for philosophical reasons. The metal orichalcum is identified variously as brass, bronze, copper with a particular patina, gold-copper alloy, or a metal that no longer exists. The concentric rings of water and land are interpreted as metaphorical or architectural features rather than geography, or natural geological formations that inspire the description, or complete inventions. The catastrophic sinking is attributed to earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, crustal displacement, comet impacts, or gradual sea level rise compressed in memory into a single event. This is confirmation bias in action. Start with the conclusion, Atlantis existed, then work backward to find evidence that supports it, while dismissing or explaining away evidence that contradicts it. It's the opposite of how archaeology and historical research actually work, which is to follow the evidence wherever it leads without predetermined conclusions and adjust your interpretations based on what you find. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas offers a particularly clear example of how this process operates. In 1968, divers discovered what appeared to be a stone roadway or wall underwater near the island of North Bimini in the Bahamas. The stones were rectangular blocks, roughly similar in size, fitted together in a way that looked deliberately arranged, extending for several hundred meters in a roughly straight line along the sea floor. Some researchers immediately declared this evidence of Atlantis. The location matched Plato's description, sort of, if you interpreted beyond the Pillars of Hercules broadly enough to include the entire Atlantic and Caribbean. The stones looked artificial, like cut blocks laid in a pattern. The depth suggested they'd been built above water when sea levels were lower, then submerged as levels rose. And Edgar Cayce, a famous American psychic, had predicted in 1940 that Atlantis would be discovered near Bimini in 1968 or 69. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence. Geologists who studied the formation determined it was natural beach rock, a type of sedimentary limestone that forms in the intertidal zone when calcium carbonate precipitates out of seawater and cements together sand and shell fragments. Beach rock commonly fractures into rectangular blocks as it hardens, creating joints perpendicular to the shoreline. The linear arrangement is consistent with ancient shoreline geology. The formation marks an old beach line from when sea level was lower during the Pleistocene. Similar beach rock formations exist in many tropical and subtropical coastal areas around the world. The blocks show no evidence of tool marks, no mortar between them, no associated artifacts like pottery or tools, nothing that would indicate human construction. The uniformity in size and shape comes from the natural fracture patterns in the rock, not from deliberate shaping. Chemical analysis of the rock shows it formed through natural processes, not quarrying and transport. Radiocarbon dating of organic material within the rock gives ages consistent with natural formation during the last ice age. But the Atlantis interpretation persists among believers. They dismiss the geological explanation as conventional thinking, unwilling to consider alternative possibilities. They argue the regular shapes are too perfect to be natural, even though nature regularly produces geometrically regular shapes through crystallization, fracture patterns, erosion, and other processes. They suggest the lack of tool marks proves the builders had advanced technology that didn't require conventional cutting and shaping tools, possibly using sound vibrations or other speculative methods. They point to what they interpret as anchor stones or dock facilities nearby, though geologists identified these as natural rock formations. The reasoning becomes unfalsifiable. Evidence that contradicts the Atlantis interpretation is either explained away through special pleading or taken as proof that the truth is being suppressed. The absence of expected evidence, tool marks, artifacts, associated structures, becomes evidence itself of advanced capabilities that left no traces. Expert consensus against the interpretation is dismissed as bias, close-mindedness, or fear of overturning established paradigms. This pattern repeats across every claimed Atlantis site. An anomaly or unusual feature is identified. It's declared inexplicable by conventional means. It's attributed to an advanced lost civilization. Counter-evidence is dismissed. The lack of supporting evidence is explained through special arguments. And the story spreads through books, documentaries, websites, and social media, reaching far larger audiences than the careful rebuttals published in academic journals. The question remains, why are these narratives so emotionally and culturally satisfying that people keep producing and consuming them, despite the lack of supporting evidence, and despite extensive expert consensus against them? Part of the answer is that mainstream archaeology and science can feel frustratingly incomplete and uncertain. We have vast gaps in our knowledge about past societies. New discoveries regularly revise our understanding. Carbon dates get recalibrated. Pottery sequences get reordered. Sites that were thought to be temples turn out to be warehouses. Cultures that seem to appear suddenly turn out to have deeper roots than we recognized. The field is genuinely full of ongoing debates, competing interpretations, and unsolved mysteries. This uncertainty is actually a strength of the scientific method. It means we're constantly testing our assumptions against new evidence and revising our understanding when the evidence demands it. But to outsiders, it can look like scientists don't know what they're talking about or keep changing their stories. If the experts can be wrong about specific dates or specific interpretations, maybe they're wrong about bigger things too. Maybe they're missing something fundamental. The real mysteries in archaeology are different from what Atlantis hunters imagine, though. The genuine puzzles are things like, how did societies without writing systems organize large-scale construction projects like Göbekli Tepe or Poverty Point? What caused the widespread collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE? How did Polynesian navigators cross thousands of miles of open ocean to colonize remote Pacific islands? Why did the major Indus Valley urban centers decline around 1900 BCE? What purposes did the massive earthworks of the Amazon basin serve? How did the agricultural practices of indigenous Americans create the terra preta soils that remain exceptionally fertile today? These are fascinating questions with real archaeological substance behind them. They represent genuine gaps in our knowledge, places where evidence is incomplete or ambiguous, situations where multiple interpretations remain viable, and scholars are actively debating the best explanations. Researching these questions means excavating carefully, documenting thoroughly, analysing materials using multiple methods, considering alternative explanations, publishing results for peer review, and remaining genuinely open to evidence that contradicts your assumptions. The Atlantis narrative offers a shortcut around all that complexity. Instead of grappling with the messy reality of how societies actually develop, unevenly, contingently, through combinations of environmental opportunity, cultural innovation, technological development, social organisation, and sheer luck, you get a simple story of a single advanced civilization that figured everything out and then lost it. It's narratively cleaner. It's emotionally simpler. It flatters the believer's intuition and skepticism of expertise. And it doesn't require learning about stratigraphy, pottery typology, radiocarbon calibration, archaeobotany, or any of the other technical knowledge that professional archaeology involves. But it's not true, and insisting it's true requires rejecting or ignoring overwhelming evidence from multiple independent scientific disciplines. The real history of human civilizations is more interesting than the Atlantis myth, precisely because it's more complicated, more varied, more creative than a single lost source could explain. The development of agriculture wasn't a gift from Atlantean survivors. It happened independently in at least 7 different regions at different times, with different crops and different techniques, emerging through long processes of human experimentation and selection. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, rice and millet in China, maize, beans and squash in Mesoamerica, potatoes and quinoa in the Andes, sorghum and yams in Africa, taro and breadfruit in New Guinea and the Pacific. Each region developed its own domesticated plants suited to local conditions. Cities emerged through gradual processes of population concentration, not from Atlantean blueprints. Uruk in Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, Erletu in China, Memphis in Egypt, Caral in Peru, San Lorenzo among the Olmec. Each arose through its own unique combination of environmental conditions, social organization, economic pressures, and cultural developments. They share some common features because similar organizational problems tend to generate similar solutions, not because they're all following a template from a vanished civilization. Technologies spread through trade, migration, cultural exchange, and independent invention. Pottery making was invented independently multiple times in different regions. So was metalworking. So were writing systems, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphics in Egypt, oracle bone script in China, Maya glyphs in Mesoamerica all emerged independently to serve local needs. The superficial similarities between these systems, using symbols to represent sounds and concepts, come from the nature of the task, not from common origin. This process of independent development and cultural exchange left evidence everywhere. Genetic evidence showing how crops were domesticated, how their DNA changed under human selection, how they spread from their centers of origin, linguistic evidence revealing relationships between languages, showing patterns of migration, trade contact, and cultural influence. Material evidence documenting how pottery styles evolved, how metallurgy developed from native copper to smelting to alloying, how architectural techniques spread and adapted to local materials and needs. Climate evidence from ice cores, ocean sediments, cave formations, and tree rings shows how environmental changes enabled or constrained cultural developments. The warming and stabilization of climate at the end of the last ice age made agriculture possible. Periodic droughts stressed agricultural societies and sometimes contributed to their collapse. El Niño cycles affected the Pacific coast of South America, influencing maritime resources that supported early complex societies there. All these lines of evidence are independent but mutually reinforcing. When geneticists study ancient DNA from domesticated wheat, their findings about where and when it was domesticated align with what archaeobotanists determine from preserved seeds, which aligns with what archaeologists find in excavated storage facilities, which aligns with what climate scientists reconstruct about when conditions became suitable for cultivation. The whole edifice supports itself from multiple directions, making the basic framework extraordinarily robust, even as details continue to be refined. Atlantis fits nowhere in this edifice. It's a story floating free from evidence, tethered only to Plato's dialogues and the human desire for it to be true. And that desire is worth examining, because it tells us something important about our relationship with the past and our needs from historical narratives. We want there to have been ages of wisdom and wonder. We want lost knowledge. We want hidden truths. We want our ancestors to have been better, wiser, more advanced than conventional history suggests. These wants are deeply human and probably adaptive in some contexts. They inspire us to preserve and recover knowledge, to respect what came before, to imagine that human potential is greater than our current achievements suggest. But when these wants override our commitment to evidence and reason, they become problematic. When we believe things because we want them to be true, rather than because evidence supports them, we drift into wishful thinking. When we dismiss expert consensus because it contradicts our preferred narratives, we lose the ability to learn from people who've devoted careers to careful study. When we construct unfalsifiable theories that explain away counter-evidence, we abandon the intellectual tools that let us distinguish reality from fantasy. Atlantis works beautifully as myth. It's been inspiring art, literature, philosophy, and speculation for 24 centuries, and will likely continue doing so for centuries more. As a story exploring themes of hubris, divine punishment, the fragility of civilizations, and the relationship between power and virtue, it remains relevant and thought-provoking. But as history, it fails completely. The evidence is overwhelming that Plato invented Atlantis as a rhetorical device for his philosophical arguments. The archaeological record contains no support for a continent-sized advanced civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, 9,000 years before Plato's time. Ocean floor geology rules out the existence of such a landmass. Human developmental history shows no gap where such a civilization could have existed. The real lost civilizations are more interesting anyway. The Indus Valley culture with its undeciphered script and mysterious decline. The Mississippian mound builders whose earthworks still dominate the landscape in parts of North America. The Tiwanaku civilization in the Andes whose stonework rivals anything in the Mediterranean. The Aksumite Empire in Ethiopia, whose stelae stand taller than any others in the ancient world. Angkor in Cambodia, whose temple complexes sprawl across hundreds of square kilometres. Great Zimbabwe, whose stone enclosures demonstrate sophisticated dry stone construction. The classical Maya, whose astronomical knowledge and mathematical sophistication produced a calendar more accurate than the one Europe used until the Renaissance. These civilizations actually existed. We have their ruins, their artifacts, their writing in many cases. They left their marks on the landscape, on their descendants, on world history. They represent genuine human achievement. Complex societies organizing large populations, building monumental architecture, developing sophisticated technologies, creating art and literature and philosophy and science. Their stories are complicated and incomplete. We're still working out how they organized themselves, what they believed, why they rose and why they fell. But that incompleteness is what makes them fascinating. Every excavation brings new discoveries. Every new analytical technique reveals information that was invisible before. Every generation of scholars brings fresh perspectives to old questions. The process of understanding is ongoing, collaborative, cumulative, and genuinely exciting for people who engage with it. That's what real archaeology looks like. Not treasure hunting, not confirming myths, not searching for lost civilizations that validate our assumptions about hidden knowledge. Just careful, systematic investigation that gradually builds a more complete and accurate picture of human history, one excavation unit at a time. Plato would probably be horrified by what his Atlantis story has become. He created it as a disposable example in a philosophical argument about political organization and moral decline. It was meant to be transparently fictional, an extreme case designed to make abstract principles concrete and memorable. The fact that people have spent over 2 millennia searching for it as a real place completely misses the point of why he wrote it. But that misappropriation reveals something important about how stories work and why they persist. Once a narrative enters culture, it takes on its own life independent of authorial intent. Readers make of texts what they need, extracting meanings the author never intended, applying stories to purposes beyond their original context. The philosophical framework Plato built around Atlantis got stripped away over centuries, and what remained were the vivid details, the concentric rings, the orichalcum, the advanced technology, the catastrophic sinking. Those details were specific enough to lodge in memory, vague enough to permit endless interpretation, dramatic enough to fuel imagination. Combined with human tendencies to prefer mystery over mundanity, hidden knowledge over conventional understanding, and personal intuition over expert consensus, they created a myth that may never die no matter how much evidence accumulates against it. And in a limited sense, that's fine. Myths don't have to be historically true to be culturally valuable. They can do important work as metaphors, as narrative structures for thinking about human nature and social organization, as imaginative spaces for exploring possibilities. The problem is when myths get confused with history, when they become vehicles for rejecting actual knowledge, when they feed into broader patterns of science denial or conspiracy thinking. Atlantis by itself is mostly harmless. It's a fun story that's inspired countless works of fiction and speculation. But when it morphs into pseudo-archaeology claiming that mainstream science is suppressing truth, when it's used to argue that experts can't be trusted, when it becomes a gateway to rejecting evidence-based reasoning more broadly, then it crosses a line from harmless myth into something more problematic. The key is maintaining clear boundaries. Enjoy the myth, appreciate its narrative power, use it as a lens for exploring philosophical questions about power and virtue. But don't mistake it for history. Don't use it to reject actual archaeological evidence. Don't let its emotional appeal override your commitment to determining what's actually true. The balance is harder to maintain than it sounds, because stories are powerful and evidence is often messy and incomplete. The Atlantis narrative offers certainty and drama and a complete arc. Real archaeology offers provisional knowledge, ongoing debates, and the satisfaction of gradually expanding understanding through careful work. One is immediately gratifying. The other requires patience and trust in processes that aren't always intuitive or exciting. But the patient approach is the one that actually works, that actually builds reliable knowledge about the world. And that knowledge, however incomplete and provisional, however much it gets revised as new evidence appears, is more valuable than any myth because it's anchored in reality. So let Atlantis rest where it belongs, in Plato's dialogues, in the realm of philosophical allegory, in the imaginative space where stories do their work without claiming to be history. Let it inspire fiction and art and speculation. Let it raise questions about hubris and virtue and the fragility of human achievement. But leave the actual work of understanding human history to the archaeologists and historians who do it professionally, following evidence wherever it leads, building knowledge carefully and systematically, revising understanding when new discoveries demand it. Trust that the real past is strange and fascinating enough without needing to add fictional civilizations. The real mysteries are worth the effort to solve. The real lost cities are worth the patience to excavate. The real story of how human societies developed across the planet over the past 12,000 years is more interesting, more varied, more impressive than any single lost source could explain. That's the paradox at the heart of Atlantis. We search for it because we want connection to something greater. But the greatness we're actually connected to, the cumulative achievement of countless human cultures developing independently and exchanging innovations, is right there in the archaeological record waiting to be understood. You don't need Atlantis. You need curiosity, patience and willingness to engage with evidence even when it's less dramatic than the myth. That's harder. That's more demanding. But the payoff is understanding something true about who we are and where we came from. And on that note, with thoughts drifting and consciousness softening towards sleep, maybe the best way to think about Atlantis is as a mirror. Not a place to find, but a reflection of what we want from the past. Not suppressed history, but revealed psychology. Not lost civilization, but present longing. What we see in the Atlantis myth is ourselves. Our hopes, our fears, our desires for connection to deep time, our need for stories that make sense of human achievement and human failure. That's worth understanding. That tells us something true, even if the story itself is false. So let it rest. Let the concentric rings sink back into the sea of imagination where they belong. Let the temples and towers fade into the philosophical discourse that created them. Let the catastrophe return to its role as moral allegory rather than historical event. And let sleep come, carrying whatever dreams it brings, freed from the need to solve ancient mysteries or validate contemporary desires. The past will keep its secrets and reveal its truths in its own time through the patient work of people who ask it the right questions. For now, just rest. The search can wait. The myths will persist. The evidence will accumulate. And morning will come with its own concerns, its own questions, its own small daily mysteries that don't require lost continents or hidden wisdom to make life interesting. That's enough. That's everything. That's all Atlantis ever needed to teach us. If you drifted somewhere between Plato's dialogue and the real volcanic ruins of Santorini, my sleepy scholars, then we've found what we were looking for. Next time someone claims they've discovered the lost city, remember, The story was always more interesting than the place could ever be. Until then, rest well. The earth has always kept better secrets than stone tablets or papyrus scrolls. Long before museums and archives, people understood that the safest way to preserve what mattered most was to hide it beneath their feet, trusting soil and silence to protect knowledge until the right moment arrived. This is the story of those deliberate concealments, the things buried not to be forgotten, but to be remembered at precisely the right time. The jar feels cool against your palms even though the Egyptian sun has been beating down on this courtyard for hours. You're crouched in what used to be someone's home, maybe 1500 years before the Romans showed up to reorganize everything. The dwelling sits on the outskirts of Akhetaten, the city that will eventually be called Amarna by people who never knew its original name. Right now, in this moment around 1330 BCE, the place still hums with the particular chaos of a capital city that sprang up too fast and might not last much longer. Your knees ache from squatting in this position, but you're committed now. The jar you're holding is heavy, made from Nile clay that someone fired carefully enough to last. It's sealed with wax and linen, which seems excessive for storing grain or oil. Your neighbours have been whispering for weeks that the old order might return soon, that the priests who got pushed aside when Akhenaten decided everyone should worship his sun disk are sharpening their metaphorical knives. Change is coming, which means danger for anyone too closely associated with the current way of things. Inside this sealed jar are three things: a small statue of Aten, the sun disk deity that Akhenaten insists is the only god worth mentioning, a handful of hymns written on pottery shards because papyrus is too expensive for someone like you, and a bronze mirror that reflects your tired face when you peek inside one last time. These objects mean something to you. They represent the last 15 years of your life, a period when it felt like the divine might actually care about regular people instead of just aristocrats and priests. You know that opinion is about to become dangerous. The hole you've dug beneath your floor is deeper than necessary. You've gone down past the packed earth, past the layer of older debris, into soil that feels different, ancient somehow, untouched. You wrap the jar in linen, then lower it carefully. Your hands are shaking, which surprises you. You've buried food stores before, hidden valuables when raiders came through, but this feels different. You're not hiding treasure from thieves. You're hiding belief itself, preserving it for a future you'll never see. As you shovel dirt back over the jar, you wonder if anyone will ever find it. Part of you hopes they won't. These objects only matter to people who shared this particular moment, this brief window when the world seemed to tilt toward something new. 100 years from now, maybe 200, they'll just be curiosities, broken pottery and tarnished bronze. The reverence will be gone, soaked away into the earth along with your intentions. But you pack the earth down firmly anyway, then scatter ash from the fire pit across the surface to make it blend in. You'll put a grinding stone here tomorrow, something heavy and utilitarian that no one would think to move. The secret will be safe, whatever that means. The irony doesn't escape you. You're preserving a religion that claimed to worship light and openness by burying it in darkness. But concealment has its own honesty. You're admitting that some truths can't survive in the open air of politics and power struggles. They need the earth's patience, its willingness to hold things without judgment until conditions change. 3,000 years later, when archaeologists sift through this exact spot, they'll catalogue your jar as votive deposit or personal cult cache. They'll photograph the contents, analyse the clay composition, radiocarbon date the linen. They'll never know you knelt here with aching knees and shaking hands, making a choice that felt enormous in the moment but will register as a minor footnote in papers about daily life during the Amarna period. Your act of desperate preservation will become data. But right now, standing up and brushing dirt from your knees, you don't know any of that. You only know that you've done what you could. The rest belongs to time, that patient excavator that eventually uncovers everything. The manuscript weighs less than you expected. But then parchment never has much heft. even when it's covered in careful script. You're standing in the library of Lindisfarne Monastery, off the northeastern coast of Britain, in the year 793. Outside, the North Sea makes that endless rushing sound that you've gotten used to, but never quite stops noticing. Today the sound feels ominous, though maybe you're projecting. The prior came back from the mainland yesterday with news that makes your stomach tight. Ships with unusual sails have been spotted. Not the trading vessels you're used to, the ones that bring salt and metalwork in exchange for the monastery's famous illuminated books. These ships move differently, low in the water and fast. The messenger who told the prior about them had that particular pale look that means he's seen something he can't quite bring himself to describe fully. In your hands is a copy of the Gospels that took Brother Edfrith 3 years to complete. You've seen him working on it, hunched over his desk in light so carefully angled that it doesn't cast shadows across the page. The gold leaf alone represents weeks of work. Applying it requires patience that would make a stonecarver weep. The illustrations in the margins contain more colours than you knew existed, and you've lived near this monastery your whole life. The decision to bury the book came from the abbot, but you're the one who volunteered to do it. Partly because you're young enough to make the trip up the coast without your knees giving out, and partly because you understand what's about to happen in a way some of the older monks don't want to acknowledge. Raiders don't come for theological discussions. They come for gold and silver, for anything that can be melted down or traded. A book like this, with its jewelled cover and gilt edges, looks like wealth. The fact that it contains the word of God won't slow anyone's axe. You've chosen a spot 3 miles up the coast, in a cave that fills with seawater during high tide, but stays dry in its upper reaches. It's the kind of place you explored as a child before you started helping at the monastery, back when the coastline was just a playground rather than a strategic consideration. The cave has a narrow entrance. You have to turn sideways to slip through, which means it's not the kind of place raiders would bother with. No storage space, no living quarters, nothing worth the effort. Inside, you've already placed the oiled leather wrapping that will keep moisture away from the parchment. The monks gave you their best materials for this task. They understand they're not just preserving a book, they're preserving hours of human attention, the kind of concentrated focus that borders on prayer. Every letter in this manuscript represents a choice. Where to thicken the stroke, how to shape the curve, which pigment to mix. Destroying it would be like burning years of someone's life. You wrap the book carefully, then place it in a wooden box that's been coated with beeswax. The box goes into a leather satchel, and the satchel goes into a niche in the cave wall that you've lined with stones. You stack more stones in front of it, arranging them to look natural, like they've always been there. A casual observer wouldn't notice anything unusual. You're counting on raiders being casual observers when it comes to empty caves. The work takes longer than expected. Your hands keep wanting to rush, to finish, and get back to the relative safety of the monastery. But rushing would mean doing this poorly, and the entire point is to do it well enough that the manuscript survives whatever comes next. So you slow down, check each stone placement, make sure the niche is completely hidden. The tide is starting to come in by the time you finish. You have to wade through ankle-deep water to get out, holding your shoes above your head and trying not to slip on seaweed-covered rocks. Walking back, you rehearse what you'll tell the abbot. The location is memorized. 3 miles north, past the distinctive rock formation that looks like a bishop's hat. The cave with the narrow entrance just above the tide line. You'll draw a map, hide it somewhere safe. The secret needs to survive even if you don't, which is suddenly feeling like a real possibility rather than abstract worry. The raiders come 2 days later. You watch from the hills as they beach their ships and move through the monastery with systematic efficiency. They're not random vandals. They know exactly what they're looking for, which buildings hold the most valuable items. The screaming doesn't last long. Monks aren't fighters, and resistance would be suicide. You see books being thrown into piles, probably to check for anything valuable tucked between pages. Most get left scattered in the mud. They're useless to people who can't read Latin. You survive by running, which makes you feel like a coward until you remember the manuscript hidden 3 miles up the coast. Cowardice with a purpose is just strategy. The prior told you that once, though he probably didn't mean it to apply to fleeing while your friends died. 1,200 years later, someone exploring that same cave will find the box purely by accident. They'll be looking for smugglers' caches or natural artifacts, not religious texts. The manuscript inside will be water damaged and fragmentary, but enough will survive to make scholars excited. They'll marvel at the preservation technique, the quality of the materials, the skill required to create something so beautiful in such a remote location. They'll write papers about workshop practices and artistic influences. They probably won't think much about the terror that motivated the burial. History tends to sand down those edges, leaving behind clean narratives about cultural preservation and artistic achievement. The desperate scramble, the calculations about death and survival, the guilt of running while others stayed, those don't make it into museum placards. You just get credited with having the foresight to preserve an important artifact. But you didn't feel foresightful, stumbling through that cave with shaking hands and watching the tide come in. You felt terrified and small and painfully aware that everything you knew was ending. The concealment wasn't strategic. It was animal instinct dressed up as preservation. The manuscript survives anyway. Sometimes panic makes better long-term decisions than planning. The smell is what you'll remember later, even more than the fear. Smoke has a particular character when it's consuming books, something acrid and complex, like breathing in centuries of accumulated thought. You're standing in the courtyard of a private library in Cordoba, in what will eventually be called Spain in the year 976. The Umayyad Caliphate is in one of its periodic upheavals, which means yesterday's acceptable scholarship is today's dangerous heresy. The library belongs to a merchant named Ibrahim, though ownership is becoming a complicated concept. Ibrahim himself left 3 weeks ago, reading political winds with the same skill that made him wealthy. He took his immediate family, his portable wealth, and about 20 books small enough to hide in saddlebags. Everything else, including you, his librarian, and the remaining 4,000 volumes, got left behind for someone else to deal with. That someone is you, which seems unfair but not surprising. You've spent 15 years organising this collection, creating catalogues, tracking down copies of texts that existed only as rumours. You know which shelf holds the only complete manuscript of a particular mathematical treatise. You know which corner contains poetry that would get people executed if the current regime found it. You know the value of every single item in this building, measured in both money and irreplaceability. The mob outside knows none of this. They know that Ibrahim was associated with the previous administration, and that's enough. They know this building contains books, and certain religious authorities have declared that most learning leads to corruption. They don't know that you've spent the last 3 weeks carefully selecting 30 volumes, not the most valuable or the most beautiful, but the most unique, and burying them in locations around the city. The jar hidden in the foundation of the abandoned mosque on the eastern edge of town contains 6 mathematical texts, including one on algebra that exists nowhere else in the Western world. The cache beneath the old Roman cistern holds poetry and philosophy, works that people might want to read again someday when politics shifts. Under your own floor, in a waterproof chest, you've placed the histories, chronicles of events that someone will eventually want to verify, once the current passion for rewriting the past subsides. You didn't save everything. That would be impossible. But you saved something, which feels simultaneously adequate and completely insufficient. Standing here now, watching smoke begin to curl from the library's upper windows, you're doing calculations about regret. Should you have taken more risks, hidden more books, found a way to smuggle them out of the city entirely? The thing about selective preservation is that it requires you to make impossible choices. Every book you buried meant abandoning 10 others. Every text you deemed important enough to save implied that others weren't. You've essentially declared yourself the arbiter of what future generations deserve to inherit, and the weight of that feels like it might crush your chest. The fire is spreading faster than you expected. The library's roof is wooden, and the summer heat has made everything tinder dry. You watch flames climb through rooms you could navigate blindfolded, consuming organizational systems that existed only in your memory. The section on astronomy goes first, 3rd floor, western corner, where the light was best for examining star charts. Then the poetry alcove, the medical texts, the collection of travel narratives that you loved reading during slow afternoons. Someone in the mob is shouting about cleansing corruption. The irony would be funny if it weren't so destructive. They're burning a repository of Islamic scholarship in the name of Islamic purity, destroying texts that scholars spent lifetimes creating and copying. But nuance doesn't survive contact with crowds. You learn that quickly over the past few weeks. The concealment you engaged in wasn't about preserving knowledge from invaders or foreign armies. It was about protecting thought from its own civilization. That's a different kind of burial, one that comes with its own particular shame. You weren't hiding from external threats. You were hiding from your neighbours, from people who share your language and religion and city. The enemy wasn't outside the walls. The enemy was the wall itself, closing in around ideas. 600 years later, someone will discover the jar beneath the cistern while doing construction. The books inside will be damaged but legible, and scholars will be excited to find texts they knew existed only from references in other works. They'll write papers about transmission of knowledge, about how certain ideas survived periods of upheaval. They'll treat your buried cache as evidence of cultural continuity. They probably won't think much about the selection process, about all the books that didn't make it into those jars. History remembers what survives, not what burned. The gaps in the record become invisible, filled in by imagination, or simply ignored as unknowable. Your agonizing choices about what to save will be hidden beneath celebration of what was preserved. But right now, watching the library collapse in on itself with a sound like the world cracking, you're very aware of the gaps. You know exactly which texts are turning to ash. You can recite titles, describe bindings, recall the specific shade of ink used by particular copyists. The absence has weight and specificity. It's not abstract loss. It's the destruction of particular things you knew individually. You'll carry that inventory for the rest of your life, a catalogue of everything that didn't make it. The buried books will feel less like salvation and more like inadequate memorial, a tiny fraction preserved to mark the magnitude of what was lost. But you'll tend them anyway, checking periodically to ensure the hiding places remain secure. Not because you believe they'll be found and appreciated, but because giving up on them would mean admitting the burning won. Sometimes preservation is just stubbornness with better planning. The jar in your hands is ordinary to the point of being boring. Brown clay, functional shape, no decoration beyond a few finger-pressed ridges around the rim where the potter's hand slipped while throwing it on the wheel. You're standing in what used to be your kitchen, in a village whose name will be forgotten, long before archaeologists assign it a catalogue number. The year is somewhere around 600 BCE, give or take a few decades. Nobody's counting precisely because counting years isn't something your community considers important. What is important right now is the fact that the jar contains something your grandmother gave you. A small bronze figurine, barely the size of your thumb, depicting a goddess whose name you don't know, but whose presence feels significant. Your grandmother received it from her grandmother, who received it from someone even further back. The chain of possession extends into time that nobody bothered recording. The figurine is old, older than anyone's memory, which gives it a particular kind of authority. The problem is that the village priest has been making speeches lately about proper worship and authorized deities. He's got backing from the regional temple, which has decided to standardize religious practice across several villages. Standardization apparently means destroying personal shrines and family heirlooms that don't align with official pantheons. You've seen neighbours hauled in for questioning about their devotional habits, which would be darkly funny if it weren't so threatening. You're not particularly devout. The figurine matters to you because your grandmother's hands held it, not because you believe it channels divine power. But explaining that distinction to someone invested in religious conformity seems unlikely to end well. So you're doing what people have done for thousands of years. When official orthodoxy conflicts with personal attachment, You're hiding the evidence. The burial spot you've chosen is in the corner of what used to be your family's grain storage area, back when the family had enough grain to require dedicated storage. Now it's just a dirt floor and stone walls, but the corner still feels appropriate. You dig down about 2 feet, which is deeper than necessary but makes you feel more secure. The hole is wider than the jar by several inches, which lets you line it with clean sand before placing the vessel inside. Before sealing the jar, you take one last look at the figurine. The bronze has that greenish patina that old metal develops, and one of the arms is broken off at the elbow. In better light, you could probably make out details of the face, but the sun is setting, and you're trying to finish this before dark. You wrap the figurine in a scrap of wool cloth, not for any ritual purpose, just to keep it from rattling around, and place it in the jar along with a small clay lamp that also belonged to your grandmother. The lamp is less emotionally significant, but including it makes the cache feel more deliberate, less like you just buried trash. You have standards, even when hiding things from religious authorities. Sealing the jar takes longer than expected. You're using beeswax mixed with tree resin, heated until it becomes liquid enough to pour but not so hot that it cracks the clay. Getting the temperature right requires attention, and you're distracted by the sound of voices from the main path. Probably just neighbours walking home, but every sound makes your shoulders tense. You're not technically doing anything illegal. Not yet. But the space between legal and questionable has been shrinking lately. Once the wax sets, you lower the jar into the hole and begin filling dirt back in. Your technique is sloppy, motivated more by nervousness than care. You'll regret that later when you can't remember the exact location, but right now, you just want this finished. The dirt gets tamped down, smoothed over, and covered with loose straw to match the rest of the floor. An observer would have to look carefully to notice any disturbance, and you're betting that most observers won't look carefully. The concealment feels anticlimactic. You expected some sense of completion or accomplishment, but mostly you just feel tired and slightly ridiculous. You've buried a broken bronze figurine and an old lamp in a dirt floor. Future archaeologists will catalogue this as a ritual deposit or votive offering, inventing elaborate theories about your motivations and beliefs. They'll analyse the placement, measure the depth, compare the artefacts to similar finds from the period. They'll be wrong about almost everything. There was no ritual, no offering, no elaborate belief system at work. Just someone trying to keep family objects away from religious busybodies, using the oldest security system in the world. Putting things underground and hoping nobody looks there. 3,000 years from now, someone will indeed find your jar. They'll write papers about continuity of goddess worship, about how old religious practices persisted in domestic contexts despite official prohibition. They'll photograph the figurine from multiple angles, analyse the bronze composition, compare its iconography to regional traditions. The broken arm will be carefully noted in the condition report. What they won't know is that you barely remember which goddess the figurine depicts. That your grandmother told you once, but you weren't paying attention because you were young and immortal and couldn't imagine caring about family heirlooms. That the burial was practical rather than devotional, motivated by fear of harassment rather than religious conviction. That you were just trying to avoid trouble, not preserve sacred mysteries for future generations. But history has a way of upgrading motivations. Your pragmatic concealment becomes evidence of religious resistance. Your forgetting becomes deliberate mystery. Your ordinary clay jar becomes a ritual vessel. The gap between what happened and what gets recorded is filled with interpretation that makes everything sound more intentional than it was. You finish smoothing the floor and step back to examine your work. The burial spot is invisible, which was the goal. Whether you'll remember where you put it in a few years is questionable, but that problem belongs to future you. Present you is just relieved to have this finished. Tomorrow you'll go about your regular business, and probably nothing will happen. The priest's enthusiasm for standardization might fade once he realizes how much work it requires, or the regional temple might get distracted by some other issue, or maybe enforcement will intensify, and you'll be grateful for your paranoid afternoon of burial. The uncertainty is exhausting. You don't know if you've preserved something important or wasted an afternoon hiding garbage. You don't know if anyone will care, now or ever. You just know that the alternative, letting the figurine be destroyed or confiscated, felt worse than the effort of concealment. So you've chosen the Earth's patience over immediate clarity. You've bet on burial as preservation, on concealment as the highest form of honouring what came before. Whether that bet pays off is someone else's problem. Generations removed from this moment and all its mundane anxieties. For now, you have an invisible jar in an unmarked spot, a secret that might never need to be revealed. It's not heroic or dramatic. It's just practical magic. The everyday miracle of making things disappear by putting them where nobody thinks to look. The tablet is surprisingly heavy for something that's mostly clay and resentment. You're holding it in both hands, standing in what passes for an office in this provincial backwater of the Akkadian Empire, around 2300 BCE. The tablet contains administrative records, grain distributions, labour assignments, the kind of bureaucratic detail that makes empire function, but bores everyone involved in creating it. The writing is cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, then baked until the words become permanent. Permanent is a relative concept you're learning. The empire is fragmenting, which you know because tax collection has become sporadic, and the governor stopped showing up to meetings months ago. When central authority collapses, provincial archives become liabilities. Whoever takes over next might have questions about who supported the previous administration, who benefited from particular policies, who can be safely purged versus who needs to be co-opted. Your name appears in these records, not prominently. You're not important enough for that, but frequently. You distributed grain, assigned labour, collected taxes on behalf of administrators who are now conveniently absent. On some of these tablets, you're the only authority figure mentioned, which means when the new regime starts looking for people to blame or examples to make, your name will surface immediately. The sensible response would be to destroy the tablets entirely, smash them, grind them to powder, scatter the fragments so thoroughly that reconstruction becomes impossible. But you've spent 5 years creating these records, maintaining an accounting system that actually works, keeping track of details that more senior officials couldn't be bothered with. The tablets represent competence in a world that doesn't produce enough of it. Destroying them feels like erasing your own existence. So you're compromising. You're selecting the most problematic tablets, the ones that connect you too directly to unpopular policies, and burying them in a sealed room in the archive building's foundation. Not destroyed, but unavailable. Hidden from whoever conducts the inevitable purge of administrative records. The burial chamber is tiny, barely large enough to crouch in. It was originally a storage niche that got sealed up when someone built an addition to the archive. You've reopened it by carefully removing stones from the wall, working at night when the building is empty. Inside, you've placed wooden shelves to keep the tablets organised, because even in concealment you can't quite abandon your professional standards. The tablets you're burying tonight document grain shipments that bypassed normal distribution channels during a famine 3 years ago. You remember that situation vividly. People were starving, official channels were clogged with bureaucratic requirements, and someone needed to act quickly. You did. You authorised emergency distributions using authority you didn't technically have, then created documentation after the fact to make it look legitimate. It worked. People ate. Nobody died. Nobody even questioned your authority because you seemed confident and had official-looking tablets to justify your decisions. But those tablets could now be read as evidence of corruption, unauthorised resource allocation, falsification of records. Whether you saved lives or committed fraud depends entirely on who's reading and what they want to prove. You stack the tablets carefully on the shelves, organised by date and type of transaction. The temptation to add some kind of explanatory note is strong. A message to future readers explaining context, defending decisions, making sure your motivations are understood. But that impulse is stupid. Anyone finding these tablets won't care about your justifications. They'll either be looking for evidence to condemn you, or they'll be so far removed from this moment that context won't matter. The other tablets on these shelves document similar situations, decisions that made sense at the time but looked questionable in record form, compromises necessitated by reality but unexplainable to people who weren't there, the gap between what happened and what got written down, then the gap between what got written down and how it might be interpreted. You're burying layers of translation failure. Once the shelves are full, you begin sealing the chamber. The stones go back in carefully, mortared with clay that matches the surrounding wall. You work slowly, making sure the repair is invisible. By tomorrow morning, this will look like solid wall, just another section of archive foundation. The tablets inside will begin their long wait for discovery, for reinterpretation, for whatever future makes of your buried bureaucracy. What you don't know, can't know, is that these tablets will remain hidden for over 4,000 years. The archive building will collapse and be rebuilt multiple times. The city itself will be abandoned, buried under windblown sand, forgotten so completely that even its name survives only in garbled references in other documents. Your carefully sealed chamber will be missed by the first wave of archaeologists, then the second, then the third. When someone finally breaks through that wall in the 1990s CE, they'll find your tablets in surprisingly good condition. Dry climate, sealed chamber, clay that was properly fired, all the preservation factors aligned. They'll carefully extract each tablet, photograph it in place, create detailed documentation of the fine context. They'll be excited because sealed archive chambers are rare and valuable. Then they'll begin translating the cuneiform and confusion will set in. These aren't the kind of records archaeologists expect to find hidden. There's no treasure, no royal correspondence, no religious texts. Just grain distributions and labour assignments, the administrative minutiae of a small provincial office. Why would someone seal these up? What's significant about routine bureaucracy? They'll develop theories. Perhaps this was a time capsule, an attempt to preserve records during political instability. Perhaps these tablets were being protected from destruction by invading forces. Perhaps there's some kind of pattern in the records that reveals important information about economic conditions or social structure. All the theories will be wrong because they assume importance. They assume someone buried these tablets because they mattered, because they contained valuable information worth preserving. They don't account for the possibility that you buried them to make them disappear, to remove evidence of decisions that might get you executed. Concealment is self-preservation rather than cultural preservation. The irony will be invisible to future scholars. By hiding these tablets, you'll ensure their survival. The records that remained in open archives got destroyed or scattered centuries ago. But your buried evidence of administrative improvisation will last longer than the empire it documented, preserved by the very attempt to make it vanish. You finish sealing the wall and step back to examine your work. The repair is clean enough that casual inspection won't reveal anything. You sweep away stone chips and scattered clay, restoring the area to its usual appearance of neglected storage space. Tomorrow you'll begin selectively destroying other records, the ones that can't be easily hidden but need to disappear. It's going to be a long week of careful arson and strategic memory loss. But tonight, you've done what you can. You've created a gap in the record, a space where your most questionable decisions can hide from immediate consequences. Whether that space eventually becomes discovery or remains permanent concealment isn't something you can control. You've just pushed the problem forward in time, trusting that distance will provide safety. The earth accepts your bureaucracy without judgment. Soil doesn't care about grain distributions or administrative authority. It just holds things, patient and indifferent, until someone decides to look. You're betting that nobody will, or at least that by the time they do, the context will be too distant to matter. It's not a perfect plan, but perfection stopped being an option when the empire started collapsing. Now you're just trying to survive with minimal consequences, using the oldest strategy available, making yourself invisible by putting your evidence underground. The pot you're wrapping in old cloth is ugly even by utilitarian standards. It's lumpy, unevenly fired, decorated with patterns that suggest the potter had seen better work but couldn't quite replicate it. You're packing it anyway because ugly pots are still useful, and you're about to leave this village without much opportunity to be selective about household goods. The year is around 900 CE, somewhere in what will eventually be called Peru, in a valley system that supports your community through a combination of farming and stubbornness. The reason for leaving is tedious. There's drought, there's political pressure from the growing Wari state, there's internal disagreement about how to respond to both problems. The details don't matter as much as the result, which is that about half the village is relocating to a valley further south, where cousins have agreed to share resources. You're going with them, which means abandoning the home your family has occupied for at least 3 generations. Abandonment requires decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. The useful goes with you: tools, seeds, textiles, anything valuable or necessary. But there's a category of objects that exist in the gap between useful and disposable. Things that have meaning but no practical function, or objects that are functional but too heavy to carry, or items that represent time and effort but not enough value to justify the space they'd occupy in your limited baggage. Your ugly pot falls into this category. It was made by your daughter when she was first learning pottery, back before she got sick. She's been dead for 2 years now, which is long enough that the grief doesn't ambush you constantly, but recent enough that her absence still creates holes in your daily routines. The pot is a clumsy record of her hands learning a craft, of afternoons spent working clay while you prepared food nearby. Taking it would mean carrying extra weight for purely sentimental reasons. Leaving it would mean abandoning one of the few tangible connections to those afternoons. The compromise you've arrived at is burial, not destruction, but removal from circulation. You're going to cache certain objects in locations around the abandoned village, hidden well enough that casual scavengers won't find them, but marked carefully enough that you could theoretically return someday and retrieve them. Theoretically. You know you're probably never coming back. But the pretense of possible return makes the burial feel less permanent than abandonment. The spot you've chosen for your daughter's pot is in the storage room of your house, in a corner where water damage has already weakened one wall. You dig down about 18 inches, which is easier than expected because the floor here is mostly fill from previous constructions. The village is old enough that you're digging through layers of other people's refuse and rebuilding. Someday your layer will be someone else's fill dirt, if there's anyone around to do building. You place the pot in the hole without ceremony. Adding ritual would make this feel too much like burial, and you're trying to maintain the fiction that this is just temporary storage. The cloth wrapping will help protect against moisture, though honestly the pot is already so poorly fired that a little water damage won't make much difference. You add a few other items to the cache: a broken grinding stone that your grandmother used, a ceramic whistle that doesn't work properly anymore, a chunk of pyrite that your daughter collected because it was shiny. None of these objects have monetary value. None would be worth stealing. They're personal in the most private sense, meaningful to you specifically, useless to anyone else. But combined, they represent the texture of your life in this place. The small accumulations that make a house feel inhabited rather than just occupied. Filling in the hole feels more final than you expected. Each handful of dirt is a small burial, a minor ending. You work slowly, partly because you're tired and partly because rushing would feel disrespectful to the objects below. When the floor is level again, you scatter ash and pottery shards across the surface to blend the disturbed area into its surroundings. Tomorrow, when you leave, this corner will look like any other part of an abandoned room. The thing about burying objects nobody wants is that they tend to stay buried. There's no incentive for treasure hunters or looters to dig through old houses looking for broken pottery and used grinding stones. Professional excavators might find them eventually, but only if they're systematic about excavation, treating every layer and feature with equal attention regardless of obvious value. 1400 years later, someone will indeed excavate this corner of your house. They'll be part of an archaeological survey documenting abandoned settlements in the valley system. Your cache will be notable primarily for being intact. Most of the rooms in the village show signs of disturbance from later occupation or animal activity. But this corner with its water-damaged wall was apparently too unpleasant for anyone to bother with. The excavator who finds your pot will recognise immediately that it's not a masterwork. but they'll also recognise that it's handmade, probably by someone learning the craft. They'll catalogue it carefully, note its find spot, analyse the clay composition. The other items in the cache will receive similar attention, measured, photographed, added to the site database. Then comes interpretation, which is where things get speculative. The excavation report will suggest this cache might represent a ritual deposit, possibly related to household abandonment practices. The combination of broken tools and personal items suggests intentional placement rather than casual discard. Perhaps this was an offering to ensure safe departure, or a way of maintaining spiritual connection to an abandoned dwelling. They'll be overthinking it. You weren't performing ritual. You weren't maintaining spiritual connections. You were just sad and reluctant to throw away your daughter's pottery. The burial was emotional management, not religious practice. But archaeology has trouble with ordinary sadness. It's not dramatic enough to explain carefully placed deposits. So emotional management gets upgraded to spiritual practice. Private grief becomes cultural pattern. The misinterpretation doesn't really matter. Your cache will be preserved and documented regardless of whether scholars understand your motivations. The objects will end up in storage at a research facility, available for future study. Your daughter's ugly pot will outlast the drought that drove you away, outlast the empires that rose and fell in this valley, outlast memory of the language you spoke while wrapping it in cloth. All because it was worthless enough that nobody bothered to dig it up looking for treasure. That's the accidental genius of burying things nobody wants. They survive through neglect rather than intention. The valuable items get found and removed. The obvious treasure gets looted. But the ordinary objects, the ones with only personal significance, stay buried simply because nobody has a reason to look for them. They wait patiently underground, protected by their own lack of value, until someone decides to excavate systematically rather than selectively. You finish covering the cache and stand up, brushing dirt from your hands. The room looks the same as it did an hour ago, abandoned, water-damaged, not worth anyone's attention. Perfect camouflage for objects that only matter to one person. Tomorrow you'll walk away from this place, heading south with your remaining possessions and diminishing hope. But part of your life will stay here, buried in a corner that nobody will care about for over 1,000 years. It's not the legacy you would have chosen, but it's the one you get, preservation through insignificance, survival through obscurity. The earth keeps better secrets when nobody's looking for them. The gold mask catches lamplight in a way that makes your eyes hurt. You're standing in a tomb chamber that's been carved out of bedrock somewhere in what will eventually be called the Mycenaean world, around 1300 BCE. The chamber is small but carefully finished, walls smoothed and plastered, floor level despite the slope of the hill above. In the centre, on a stone platform, lies someone important. Important enough for a gold death mask. Important enough for a tomb that required weeks of labour to prepare. You're here because you're one of the craftspeople responsible for finishing the tomb. Not the main architect or the goldsmith who created the mask, but one of the workers who smoothed the walls, sealed the floor, installed the door mechanism, the technical labour that makes grand gestures possible. Tomorrow the tomb will be sealed permanently, the door blocked with stones and plastered over, the entrance concealed to prevent robbery. Tonight is your last chance to see the work complete. The deceased's personal effects are arranged around the platform, weapons, pottery, jewellery, a few items that suggest religious significance. Standard burial goods for someone of rank. What's not standard are the other objects in the chamber, tucked into corners and niches, things that weren't mentioned in the official funerary plan. Someone, probably several someones, has been adding items to the tomb without authorization. You notice a clay tablet with what looks like accounting records, a bronze tool that's clearly been used for leatherworking, a small statue that doesn't match the regional style. These aren't burial goods in the traditional sense. They're hiding. Someone is using this tomb as a secure storage location, counting on the fact that sealed tombs don't get opened unless looters breach them. The impulse to add something of your own is sudden and hard to resist. You've got a small bronze chisel in your tool bag. the one you've been using for the detail work on the walls. It's a good chisel, well balanced, comfortable in your hand after months of use. But it's also potentially evidence that you were here, that you had access to elite spaces, that you possess skills which might be valuable or dangerous depending on who's asking. The political situation has been unstable lately. The kingdom is dealing with succession disputes and external pressure from groups the officials dismissively call sea peoples, though that phrase seems to encompass anyone arriving by boat looking for new places to settle. Instability creates opportunity but also risk. Skilled workers like you become valuable during construction booms and expendable during contractions. Your name is on employment records, tied to projects that might become politically problematic. Burying the chisel in this tomb would remove that evidence from circulation. It would also preserve a small piece of your working life, though that motivation feels secondary to the practical concern of making certain objects disappear. You wrap the chisel in a scrap of wool, then tuck it into a niche in the wall, behind the pottery that was officially placed there. Anyone opening the tomb would need to remove multiple items to reach your hidden addition. The concealment takes about 3 minutes. You're practiced at making yourself useful without being noticed, which is a survival skill for workers in royal contexts. When you leave the tomb chamber and help seal the door, you're confident that nobody saw you add an unauthorized burial good. The chisel will stay there, forgotten and invisible, until some future moment when the tomb gets opened. That moment comes about 3,000 years later, when archaeologists excavate the tomb as part of a systematic survey of Bronze Age burial practices. The opening of the sealed door is documented photographically, every step measured and recorded. The initial discovery of the gold mask creates immediate excitement. Intact elite burials are rare enough to be significant. Then comes the detailed cataloguing of grave goods, and confusion begins to set in. Why is there a tablet with accounting records in a burial context? Why does the tomb contain working tools alongside ceremonial objects? Why are some items clearly damaged or worn while others appear to be unused? The assemblage doesn't match expected patterns for elite burial. The excavators develop theories. Perhaps this tomb was reused, opened and refilled at a later date with mixed deposits from different periods. Perhaps the burial goods represent a cross-section of the deceased's life, including their administrative role and craft patronage. Perhaps there's some ritual significance to including damaged tools alongside pristine ceremonial items. Your bronze chisel gets catalogued as a burial good, analysed for metallurgical composition, compared to other bronze tools from the period. Someone writes a paper about craft production and elite patronage, using your hidden chisel as evidence that the tomb's occupant had direct connections to metalworking workshops. The paper's conclusions are entirely wrong, but they're published in a respectable journal and cited by other researchers. The misunderstanding is complete. Your act of concealment, hiding a tool to remove evidence of your access, becomes interpreted as reverent burial, as intentional inclusion in funerary assemblage. The tomb accidentally becomes a time capsule because multiple people used it as a hiding place, each concealing items for reasons that had nothing to do with honouring the deceased. The funny part, which you'll never know, is that the deceased probably wouldn't have minded. Elite tombs were always partially fiction, carefully staged presentations of status and power that may or may not have reflected the person's actual life. Adding random hidden objects just makes the fiction more complex without fundamentally changing it. The tomb was already a performance. You just added some unauthorized props. But that's the thing about burial contexts. They're supposed to be permanent and sealed, which makes them paradoxically attractive for temporary concealment. People hide things in tombs counting on the fact that disturbing the dead is taboo. They don't account for future generations who treat ancient tombs as historical artifacts rather than sacred spaces, who open sealed chambers in the name of knowledge rather than respect. Every systematically excavated tomb contains this tension. The original intention versus later interpretation, the planned assemblage versus accidental additions, the official narrative versus hidden realities. Archaeology catalogues everything with equal attention, which means your hastily concealed chisel gets the same scholarly treatment as the gold death mask that required months of skilled labour to create. Equal documentation doesn't mean equal understanding. The mask was meant to be seen and interpreted, designed to communicate specific messages about status and importance. Your chisel was meant to disappear, to exist in the space beyond interpretation. But burial equalizes everything. Underground, intention dissolves. Only the objects remain, waiting for someone to dig them up and assign new meanings that may or may not have anything to do with why they were placed there. You helped seal the tomb with the satisfaction of knowing your evidence was safely hidden. The irony that you actually ensured its preservation, that concealment in a sealed tomb is one of the best ways to guarantee an object survives for millennia, wouldn't have brought you comfort. You were thinking in terms of immediate safety, not long-term archaeological value. The tomb stands sealed for 3,000 years, holding multiple layers of concealment and intention, some planned and some accidental. When it finally opens, the archaeologists find exactly what they expected, an elite burial with all its associated complexity and ambiguity. They just don't realise that some of that complexity was people like you, using the space for purposes the architects never intended. Time capsules work best when they're accidents. Intentional preservation comes with explanatory notes and careful curation. But accidental time capsules, sealed spaces that accumulate unauthorised additions, that become hiding places as well as burial sites, those capture something more honest about how people actually interact with sacred spaces. They show the gap between official function and practical use, between intended purpose and opportunistic adaptation. Your chisel sits in a museum storage drawer now, labelled and catalogued, part of an assemblage that scholars still argue about. The debates will continue because the evidence is genuinely confusing, a mix of intentional burial and hidden concealment that doesn't resolve into a clean narrative. That confusion is the most accurate part. It's the only thing about the tomb that truly represents the complicated, improvised reality of the world that created it. The manuscript in your hands is incomplete, and you did that on purpose. You're sitting in a workshop in medieval Paris, probably around 1200 CE, though the exact year matters less than the fact that it's several decades after the Albigensian Crusade finished destroying most of the Cathar communities in southern France. The workshop belongs to a bookbinder who doesn't ask questions about the texts he's hired to copy and preserve, which is why you're here instead of somewhere more reputable. The manuscript is a copy of theological writings from the Cathar tradition, not the main texts, which are already too dangerous to preserve, but secondary materials, commentaries, and letters that explain practices and beliefs. You've spent 3 months producing this copy, working from memory and fragments of partially burned documents that you salvaged from a house in Toulouse. The original materials are gone, destroyed by crusaders or their local allies, condemned to deliberate forgetting by ecclesiastical authorities. Your copying wasn't exact. You changed names, removed references to specific locations, edited out passages that seemed most likely to trigger prosecution if the manuscript was discovered. You also added ambiguity in places where the original was clear, creating textual confusion that might protect readers from accusations of heresy. The result is a document that preserves some information about Cathar beliefs, while deliberately obscuring other details. This is selective memory on purpose, preserving enough to maintain continuity while concealing enough to provide protection. It's also exhausting. Every editing decision required judgment calls about danger versus accuracy, about what future readers might need to know versus what might get them killed. You've essentially decided which aspects of Cathar thought deserve to survive and which can be safely forgotten. The bookbinder is preparing a special binding for the manuscript, one with a false cover that makes it look like a standard prayer book. Inside that binding you'll add additional concealment, blank pages at the beginning and end, innocuous prayers copied onto the first few folios, anything that creates space between casual inspection and the actual content. The manuscript will be buried not in earth but in plain sight, hiding among legitimate religious texts in the library of someone sympathetic to the cause. Plain sight burial is riskier than physical concealment, but potentially more accessible. A manuscript buried underground might survive indefinitely, but it serves no purpose if nobody can read it. A manuscript hidden in a library might be discovered and destroyed, but it might also be read and copied, creating new chains of transmission. You're betting on circulation over preservation, on use over security. The decision isn't entirely rational. Part of you knows that the Cathar tradition is effectively finished, that no amount of manuscript preservation will resurrect communities that were physically destroyed, but giving up on preservation feels like accepting the Crusaders' victory, like agreeing that certain ideas deserve permanent erasure. So you're creating this incomplete, edited, concealed manuscript as a form of resistance that you know is probably futile. The funny thing about selective memory is that the selections themselves become historical artifacts. 700 years later, when scholars finally gain access to the manuscript you're creating tonight, they'll recognise immediately that it's been edited. The missing passages will be obvious from contextual clues and grammatical gaps. They'll write papers about what was removed and why, developing theories about the manuscript's transmission history. Some theories will be accurate. Scholars will correctly identify that you removed names and locations to protect people. They'll recognise the passages where you added deliberate ambiguity to create interpretive flexibility. The textual analysis will be sophisticated and mostly correct about your methods. What they'll miss is the emotional weight of those editing decisions, the specific anguish of choosing which theological concepts to preserve and which to let fade, the guilt of knowing you're creating an incomplete record that will shape how future generations understand Cathar beliefs, possibly forever. The lonely certainty that you're probably the last person who knows what the original texts actually said, making you simultaneously preserver and destroyer. You finish binding the manuscript into its false cover and step back to examine the work. It looks innocuous, exactly as intended. Someone casually examining it would see a well-made but unremarkable prayer book, the kind of text that wealthy households commission as displays of piety. The hidden content is invisible without careful reading, protected by the camouflage of orthodox religiosity. Tomorrow you'll deliver it to the library where it will begin its long concealment. The librarian who accepts it will ask no questions, file it carefully among similar volumes, and forget about its existence. The manuscript will sit undisturbed for centuries, gradually accumulating the physical characteristics of age. Brittle pages, faded ink, binding damage that will make later conservators nervous about handling it. Its content will survive not because of your preservation efforts, but despite them. Your careful editing and concealment will make the manuscript less interesting to potential destroyers, allowing it to hide effectively. But that same editing will frustrate later scholars who want access to the complete original texts. Your compromise between preservation and protection will satisfy nobody perfectly, which is maybe appropriate. Compromises rarely do. The selective memory you've created isn't false exactly. Everything in the manuscript is accurate as far as it goes, but it's incomplete in ways that matter, gaps that can't be filled because the sources no longer exist. You've created a deliberate amnesia, a structured forgetting that preserves some things by concealing others. Whether future readers will thank you or curse you for those choices is unknowable and probably irrelevant. You're not preserving for gratitude. You're preserving because the alternative, letting everything disappear without resistance, feels worse than creating an imperfect record. The manuscript might never be read by sympathetic audiences. It might be discovered by hostile authorities and destroyed anyway. But at least you tried. At least you didn't accept erasure without attempting preservation, however flawed. The concealment is complete. The manuscript exists in a state of simultaneous visibility and invisibility, physically present but intellectually hidden, available but not accessible, preserved but not complete. It's a perfect metaphor for selective memory, for the way communities try to maintain continuity through periods of violent suppression. You preserve what you can, conceal what you must, and hope that future circumstances will allow for more complete revelation. That revelation will never come, not really. The Cathar tradition will remain a subject of scholarly debate and historical speculation, known primarily through hostile sources and incomplete fragments, like your manuscript. The deliberate gaps you created will become permanent features of the historical record. Future understanding will be shaped by your editing choices, made in this workshop on a night when you felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of deciding what deserves to be remembered. But that's always how it works. Memory is selective not just because human brains have limits, but because preservation requires choices. What to save, what to risk, what to conceal, what to reveal. These decisions shape historical understanding more than most people realize. The past doesn't survive intact. It survives in edited form, shaped by individuals who made desperate compromises between accuracy and safety, between completeness and survival. Your manuscript represents one of those compromises. It's not heroic or particularly noble. It's just someone trying to preserve something while acknowledging that perfect preservation is impossible. The earth isn't the only way to bury secrets. Sometimes you hide them in books, protected by deliberate incompleteness and strategic ambiguity. The shovel hits something solid, and your heart sinks because you know what it means. You're standing in a construction site in what will eventually be called Beijing, in the year 1974, though you'd probably identify it as the 63rd year of something else, depending on which calendar system you were using. The construction site is supposed to become part of a water pump station, mundane infrastructure for a growing city. What it's become instead is the biggest archaeological complication of your career. You're not an archaeologist. You're a farmer who got recruited for construction labour because the work pays better than farming, and you're young enough to handle physical demands. Hitting solid objects underground should be routine. You found old foundations, bits of wall, scattered pottery and dozens of previous excavations. But this is different. The object you've hit is curved and smooth, and clearly not natural. More importantly, it's large in a way that suggests there are additional large objects nearby. You stop digging and call over the site supervisor, who has enough experience to recognise immediately that this is a problem. Within an hour, actual archaeologists arrive, bringing equipment and excitement and a bureaucratic energy that suggests your simple construction job just became complicated. By the end of the day, the site is shut down and converted into an official excavation. What you found, though you won't understand the significance for several weeks, is part of the terracotta army. Thousands of life-size clay soldiers buried alongside China's first emperor over 2,000 years ago. It's one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and you found it by accident while trying to install water infrastructure. The excavation that follows is careful and systematic and takes years. Archaeologists document everything in meticulous detail, photographing each soldier's position, recording soil composition, analysing breakage patterns. You get to watch some of this, reassigned from construction to excavation support, moving dirt and helping set up equipment. The work is less profitable than construction, but more interesting, at least initially. What becomes clear as excavation progresses is that the army was buried deliberately, but discovered accidentally. The tomb complex was designed to remain hidden indefinitely, protected by earth and secrecy. The emperor's grave goods were meant to accompany him in death, not to be displayed in museums or photographed by tourists. The burial was concealment with no expectation of revelation. But time and political change undid those intentions. The dynasty that buried the emperor was overthrown relatively quickly. Records of the tomb's location were lost or deliberately suppressed. Centuries passed. The mound that marked the emperor's burial became just another hill, notable mainly for being artificial, but no longer connected in public memory to any specific burial. The terracotta soldiers underground became forgotten, their existence known only to soil and earthworms. Your accidental discovery transforms that concealment into exposure. Within months, the site becomes a major archaeological project. Within years, it's a tourist destination. The soldiers that were meant to remain forever buried are now among the most photographed artifacts in the world. The Emperor's attempt at permanent concealment has been comprehensively defeated by a farmer installing water pumps. The irony would be funny if it weren't so complete. The Emperor commanded resources that most ancient rulers couldn't imagine. Thousands of workers, years of labour, an entire industry of craftspeople producing clay soldiers. All that effort went toward creating a concealed tomb that would never be disturbed, and it worked, mostly. The tomb remained sealed and hidden for over 2 millennia, far longer than most ancient burials, but forever is longer than 2,000 years. Eventually someone expands a city, decides they need water infrastructure, digs in the wrong spot, and suddenly your secret is international news. The concealment that seemed permanent was just waiting for the right combination of technology and accident to breach it. Watching the excavation proceed, you start noticing details that the archaeologists find fascinating, but that strike you as sad. The soldiers were painted originally, but most of the paint flakes off almost immediately upon exposure to air. The preservation inside the sealed tomb was nearly perfect, but exposure to oxygen begins degradation within minutes. The archaeologists work frantically to document original paint colours before they fade, but they're racing against chemistry that they can't quite win. The soldiers were better preserved when buried. Discovery initiated destruction, or at least transformation. The very act of revealing them changed their nature from preserved artifacts to deteriorating objects requiring constant conservation. You've helped convert permanent concealment into permanent maintenance. The tourists who will eventually flood this site won't think about that trade-off. They'll see impressive ancient sculptures, marvel at the craftsmanship, take photos next to their favourite soldiers. The loss of paint and the ongoing conservation challenges will be invisible to casual viewers, mentioned maybe in small text on informational plaques that nobody reads carefully. The transformation from buried secret to public spectacle will seem like an obvious improvement. Of course, it's better for these artifacts to be seen and studied rather than remaining hidden underground. But you're not sure. The soldiers were doing fine underground. They didn't need to be found. The Emperor's concealment strategy was actually working. Your discovery didn't rescue them from obscurity. It interrupted a preservation technique that was successfully maintaining them for millennia. You've essentially destroyed a system that worked in order to implement one that requires constant intervention. The archaeologists don't talk about it this way. They're excited about the information revealed, about insights into Qin dynasty military organization and artistic practices. The discovery enables research that would be impossible if the soldiers remained buried. From that perspective, your accident was beneficial. It converted inaccessible information into available knowledge. But conversion costs something. The soldiers will never again experience the stable environment that preserved them so effectively. They'll be maintained, certainly, protected by modern conservation techniques and climate-controlled displays. But maintained is different from preserved. Maintained requires continuous effort, constant vigilance, technological infrastructure that might fail. Preserved just required being left alone. You're not an archaeologist or a philosopher, so these thoughts remain largely unvoiced. You go back to construction work once the excavation no longer needs manual labour. The site becomes a museum complex that you visit occasionally, seeing your accidental discovery transformed into tourist attraction. Each visit is strange, watching crowds of visitors photograph soldiers that you personally uncovered, seeing gift shops sell miniature replicas of artifacts that you held in your actual hands before the archaeologists arrived. The disconnect between the buried soldiers and the tourist attraction is complete. The objects remain physically the same clay, same faces, same swords, but their meaning has transformed entirely. They've gone from burial goods to museum pieces, from concealed secrets to public knowledge. The Emperor's intention to keep them hidden has been comprehensively overridden by historical accident, and that's ultimately what your discovery revealed. Not just clay soldiers, but the fragility of permanent concealment. No matter how much effort goes into hiding something, no matter how effective the concealment technique, eventually someone installs plumbing in the wrong spot, and suddenly your secret is displayed under museum lights. Time defeats all burial, given enough patience and accidental excavation. The emperor probably wouldn't be happy about this outcome. He went to considerable trouble to ensure permanent concealment, using strategies that were sophisticated for their time. But he couldn't account for political collapse, for dynasties ending, for cities expanding over former burial grounds, for technologies he couldn't imagine being used by people who didn't care about his intentions. You destroyed his secret by accident with a shovel and a water pump project. The elaborate concealment that took years to construct was breached in an afternoon by someone who had no idea what they were uncovering. And now those soldiers stand in climate-controlled halls, stared at by millions of tourists, their paint mostly gone and their purpose entirely transformed. The Earth kept the secret well. It was people who couldn't leave it alone, and so the buried things eventually surface, transformed by time and discovered by accident, their original purposes obscured by layers of soil and interpretation. The secrets that people carefully concealed, from religious persecution, political upheaval, personal grief, administrative convenience, become archaeological data, museum displays, scholarly debates. The act of burial preserves but also transforms, changing private meanings into public artifacts, turning desperate concealment into celebrated discovery. You've walked through different centuries, different motivations, different outcomes, but the pattern remains consistent. People bury things when they can't protect them openly, trusting the Earth's patience over human uncertainty. Sometimes the concealment works permanently. Sometimes it works until someone accidentally breaks through. Either way, the buried object exists in a suspended state between intention and discovery, waiting for someone to decide its fate through deliberate search or random excavation. The Earth doesn't judge these concealments. It just holds them, patient and indifferent, until the weight of time or the curiosity of strangers brings them back to light. And in that patient holding, sometimes things survive that never would have lasted in the open air of their own time. The paradox of burial, that hiding can preserve better than display, remains as true now as it was when people first thought to place valuable objects beneath their feet and trust soil over neighbours. The secrets are still there, in thousands of locations, waiting for their own accidental discoveries or remaining permanent in their concealment. Each one represents someone's calculation about danger and preservation, about what deserves to survive and what protective methods might work. The buried truths outnumber the discovered ones by orders of magnitude. Most secrets stay secret. We only hear about the ones that resurface, which creates a misleading impression about the success rate of concealment. But lying there in comfortable darkness, you can appreciate the elegance of Earth as archive. It doesn't require maintenance or passwords. It doesn't judge content or worry about relevance. It just accepts what it's given and holds it until someone decides to look. That's better than most security systems humans have invented. And it's been working since people first recognized that sometimes the best way to preserve something is to make it invisible for a while, or forever, depending on who's asking and what they're looking for.